And again, welcome everyone to Teaching to Fish, the Power of Self-Assessment. For those of you that have been following the webinars, you may notice that the Teaching to Fish phrase comes from a previous presentation, one that was given last week on assessment as learning. And we'll review some of those topics in just a moment. So let's get started. The first question that I'd like to pose for us as sort of a discussion starter is, who is responsible for assessment? As you think about assessment in learning organizations right now, why don't you type in the chat the first thing that comes to mind? Maybe not necessarily your ideal, what you believe or what you want, but what comes to mind for you? Who is primarily responsible for assessment? Okay, we have a litany of very similar responses here. Teacher or the teaching assistant in some contexts. Right, so that's the way that we typically approach this, or the state. Okay, very good. In terms of aggregate data, assessment of larger populations of students, sometimes we might look at a larger body outside of the learning organization. Interestingly enough, when we ask that question, we rarely, our initial thought, those of us that are in the field of education, we rarely say the learner. And there are a number of reasons behind that, and I wouldn't argue that necessarily has to be the first response. And yet, in this presentation, part of what I'm going to argue and part of what I'm going to suggest or even offer is a way for us to think about assessment so that one of the first things that comes to mind is not necessarily the teacher, but this is a shared partnership. That assessment is the responsibility in one way formally of the teacher, but effective learners also take responsibility for assessment. As learners grow in their capacity to become self-directed learners, they also grow in their ability to self-assess. Those two skills are connected in a very significant way, where it's unlikely to find people who are strong self-directed learners who don't also have the capacity to engage in some form of self-assessment. So the other thing that I'll share, and this is a review of some slides from a previous presentation, as we get into this conversation, what I'm really talking about here is yet another way of trying to promote a culture of learning in our organizations as opposed to a culture of earning. In many cases, assessments are very closely connected to grades and to earning sort of accolades and external representations of student performance or student achievement in some way. And in many cases, those can become the dominant force where learners are motivated by a grade, to earn a grade, or to achieve a passing score, to pass or to move on, to earn placement in the next level, or whatever else it might be. In fact, we find this with all types of learners. We find this with learners who are struggling and afraid of failing, and they can slip into this culture of earning, where they just want to earn enough to get by. We also see this from our highest achievers in our schools sometimes, where they're very committed to earning the highest possible grade. In fact, my guess is that some of you have had students or worked with learners in the past who became very upset when they earned something like a 97% because it wasn't 100%, or a 98%, and they might sort of lobby for just that extra point or two because they want to earn the highest grade possible. Right. So Beth, you mentioned that. In fact, I believe in the last time we talked, in the last live session, I mentioned Bartle's game psychology. I'm not sure if I did mention it to the whole group, but Bartle is a person who studied the psychology of gamers, and what he found is that there are basically 4 categories of gamers, and I happen to believe that those categories apply to people in schools and courses and other places. One type of gamer is the killer or the competitor, the one who feels a sense of worth and accomplishment whenever they have defeated or earned something higher than the next person. That might be the person in the class who's okay with a B as long as everyone else got a B minus, or they want to make sure that they are among the highest, or they're among the top ranked in the class. A second category is the achiever. And the achiever is one who is really rewarded by the letter grade or the highest possible grade. So they want to achieve that pinnacle, that whatever that is that represents high achievement, a letter grade. They want to be on the honor society, something like that. A third is the explorer, and the explorer is a person who's rewarded by being the person who has insight or knowledge that's maybe not available to other people, or they're among the first to have discovered something. Those are wonderful people to have in open courses, by the way, because those are the people that are contributing new ideas and resources all the time. And then a fourth category would be those who are socializers. And those are people who are really rewarded in a learning organization when they have a chance to collaborate with other people and to accomplish something together, right? Um, so the challenge here is in many of our learning environments, we elevate letter grades and we elevate assessments to this point where they become sort of front and center. And the achiever is the only one who's really sort of fed what inspires them in some ways. And I would argue that we can build a broader culture of learning where we still may have letter grades and we may have these other things, but where what really drives the learning community is a genuine desire to learn and a genuine value for learning. This doesn't mean that they don't want some kind of end result. People understand that when they learn, doors are open for them in the future. They have future possibilities, and that's perfectly acceptable. But I would argue that self-assessment is a great way to help us start to cultivate more of a culture of learning within our organizations. Now to the first part of the title. This is another pair of images that I shared in a previous presentation. And part of the title for this presentation tonight is Teaching to Fish, and moving to self-assessment. So on the left-hand side, you see a fish distribution center. You see a place where people order the fish that have been caught and prepared for them, and they take the fish and they head out. On the right-hand side, you see a father or a male figure with a young boy teaching the boy how to fish. Now, the question that I posed last week is, which most represents your classroom or your learning organization or the learning organizations you participate in as either a learner or a teacher or both? And so what I'm arguing is that the FIST Distribution Center is one where we disseminate knowledge, we distribute knowledge to learners, and yet we're doing quite a bit of the work. On the other hand, on the other side, there's a person who's disseminating knowledge and they're training, but the goal is very different. The goal is not simply to disseminate fish for today, but is to equip them with the skills that will allow them to get their own fish for a long period of time. And that's what we're getting at as well when we start talking about self-assessment. By the way, I'm really big about starting presentations with the why. And that's why I do spend quite a bit of time early on in each of these presentations building a strong case for why does this matter? Why is this significant? And that's really why I spend so many slides on it. So let's get to that question directly. Why self-assessment? Well, I offer 5 affordances or benefits of self-assessment. One is that self-assessment is a critical skill if we want students to become more self-directed learning. If we want students to have to call us every time that they have a problem or anytime they need to get feedback on something, they have to get help from us and they'll just stay connected to their teachers throughout their entire life, well, then we wouldn't really need to promote self-directed learning. On the other hand, if we do want them to become self-directed, to have this ability to choose things that they want to learn and to develop a plan for learning it and to even check their understanding as they go about learning it, well, that's where self-assessment becomes a critical skill. Now, part of self-assessment can actually be knowing when you need other people to assess your work as well, that sort of self-awareness to know that. But I would still put that in the category of self-assessment in some way. The second is that self-assessment, if we can add more self-assessment or we can equip learners to self-assess, then it adds a form of formative feedback to any learning environment. Even a learning environment where an instructor doesn't provide much formative feedback. It might be one of those college courses where there's a paper and a couple of tests and that's it. And if you don't perform well on the first test, then your grade is shot, and you don't have much of a chance of achieving the grade that you want, right? Um, and then some people would argue that that's really not doing much for the learner. In essence, it's rewarding the people who didn't need the learning environment very much, and they could have just done it on their own. On the other hand, a learning environment that has ample formative feedback is one that gives learners a chance to practice and to get a sense of whether they're progressing toward achieving a given goal. Well, if we can equip learners with the ability to add their own formative feedback in the form of self-assessment, then that can equip learners to really flourish and succeed even when the teacher doesn't intentionally provide those kind of formative feedback opportunities. So I would argue that this is sort of equipping students with a tool that allows them to find success in environments where they might not otherwise be successful. The third one is that self-assessment can help students embrace assessment as learning. As I talked about, there's much that we can learn within the assessment. And I even referenced a study last time about, or maybe a couple of times ago, where if we take two populations of students, and one population studies for a test and the other takes practice quizzes and then takes the test, that the one who takes the practice quizzes often performs better than the one who just studied because they received some form of feedback, right? And then they can also learn a little bit about themselves. Well, how is my studying working for me? What kind of studying is helpful and what kind of studying is not helpful? And they can begin to adjust their behaviors in order to find more success. Well, self-assessment can help students develop that kind of self-awareness in order to make those adjustments. A fourth is that it can help students to see the connection between assessment and learning. Many of you have probably run into this as well. There are many instances where learners just don't see the connection. Yes, Jennifer, exactly. Many studies demonstrating that practice tests are one of the more effective ways to study, and that lends itself toward the argument that formative feedback is one of the most powerful things we can provide to help students be successful. So it helps students make the connection between assessment and learning, though. Many times students are taking tests and they're completing assignments, but they don't see how all of these things are connected. And oftentimes they see tests as things that they have to perform on, they're things they have to endure, they have to study for, but they don't necessarily see them as tools that help them learn more than without them. And so self-assessment can help students to kind of make that bridge and make that connection between assessment and actually what I'm learning, how I'm progressing. The last one I'll offer then is that assessment can help one move from assessment as something that's done to me versus assessment is something that I do to learn. The first understanding of assessment is it's something that's done to me. It's a passive activity in a sense. The other is assessment. The learner has a more active role in it. Assessment is seen as a tool for learning and for discovering. And that's something that I found as I talk to many successful learners and people who are self-directed learners and they learn a lot outside of the classroom. They've become very effective at figuring out how they're progressing, what they've discovered, what their struggles are, what their successes are, what their strengths are, what their limitations are, and they use that to refine their strategies for learning whatever it is they want to learn. And that becomes really, really valuable. Now, I shared these images last time as well. They were on different slides, but one thing that I shared was on the left-hand side a mirror, and I was making the analogy of an assessment as a kind of mirror in that it gives us a picture of where we are at the moment. And I told a story about the image in the top right-hand corner that I sort of made up, right? Which was an example of my waking up in the morning, and I was going to a meeting, a webinar, and I pop up the camera, and lo and behold, the first thing that I see is my hair sticking straight up. But I had no idea that it was sticking up. This didn't really happen, but I was just using it as a sort of fictional scenario situation to make a point. And so the point is, I didn't have any feedback. I didn't have a mirror. I didn't look at a mirror. And nothing really told me sort of what my hair looked at. And so until I reached that sort of embarrassing moment, which you can consider maybe even a summative type of assessment, depending upon the nature of that presentation. On the other hand, we have the bottom picture where I got that feedback and I was able to quickly adjust my hair and make it look a little bit um, more appropriate for the situation. And yeah, no offense for those who like the style on the top, go for it. That's great. But the goal is it intentional or not, right? Do I know where things are or not? And that's really what we're talking about with self-assessment as well. Is there a way that we can help students discover what their hair looks like, or what their level of knowledge looks like, or what their skill level is at a given time, and then be able to adjust? So the other thing that I shared last time is that these sort of 4 steps that are involved in assessment as learning, which is 1, there's a learning experience. 2, there's some feedback on one's progress. 3, the learner then uses that feedback to monitor their progress. And then 4, the learner adjusts thoughts or actions accordingly. So that's assessment as learning, where you can see, especially with number 3, where the learner is monitoring their feedback. The learner is not waiting for a teacher to do the monitoring and tell them what to do next. The learner is actually making the changes. And that's, again, that spirit of assessment as learning. But we're going to hone in now on specifically self-assessment. Oops, I'm going to skip this slide for now. Okay, so let me take you through this slide for a moment, and we'll start at the top. So this slide represents a common approach to a learning experience. 1, the student experiences a lesson. 2, the student is asked to perform on some sort of assessment, formative or summative. 3, the teacher assesses the student. And then finally, the assessment is documented, and oftentimes that contributes to some sort of final grade. But let me offer then, as a replacement, this perspective that's based on Kolb's experiential learning cycle, which is, first, at the top, we have the learner has a learning experience. Second, the learner then reflects on the learning experience. Third, the learner forms some kind of lessons. Well, what did I learn from this experience? As they reflect, then they begin to kind of systematize their reflections into a series of lessons, 1 or more lessons. And then they test out those lessons to see if they hold true, if they work for them, right? This, I would argue, is getting a little bit closer to what we're trying to accomplish with self-assessment. The second part, reflection on the learning experience, in this case, is an example of a self-assessment. The learner's reflecting on what happened, what they did well at, what they didn't do so well at, and then they start to try to extrapolate from that some lessons that they want to learn. Let me just jump to this next one. Another way of approaching this then is looking at the difference between a teacher-directed and a self-directed learning environment. I'm not arguing that we have to turn every learning environment into a self-directed one, but I do argue that every classroom or learning environment is somewhere on a spectrum between these two, with each of these questions. So for example, or a continuum, on the left-hand side, for a teacher-directed class, the question that helps establish the learning outcome is, what do the students need to learn? In a fully self-directed learning environment, the question that determines the learning outcome is, what do I need or want to learn? Now, most of us are teaching or working in traditional learning environments where we don't have the ability to let students simply spend their entire day choosing to learn whatever they want to learn without any kind of direction or any reference to standards or outcomes or course level goals or objectives or anything like that, although there are some examples of self-directed learning schools for primary and secondary schools. The second one, though, is how will I know when they learned it? And that's where the teacher is asking about some kind of summative or some kind of final assessment. What will the students do to show that they've actually met this goal or this objective? That's the teacher-directed. The self-directed learner, though, is asking the question, how will I know when I've learned it? So this is the learner who's actually trying to establish some kind of criteria that will be used to determine when they've achieved a given goal. On the left-hand side, then, for the third one, we have How will I monitor their progress? So this is where the teacher plans for formative feedback and plans for tools for checking the student's understanding as they progress. But on the right-hand side, we have in the self-directed, the learner saying, how am I going to monitor my own progress? And the learner is taking responsibility for creating some plans for formative assessment along the way. Then we have finally the last one, how will I help them learn it? This is where the teacher plans out a lesson or a series of lessons or creates readings or other experiences they want the students to have in order to help them achieve the stated goals. On the self-directed classroom, however, we have the learner asking, how am I going to learn this? What am I going to do to learn this? Now, as you look at this, I'm curious, as you think about your own learning environments, whether you think of one as a student or something that you might teach right now, where do you see yourself? If teacher-directed is a 0 and self-directed is a 10, where do you see your classes right now, or the classes that you work on, or maybe you have to choose a specific one because it varies. Again, teacher-directed being a 0 and self-directed classroom being a 10. Where do you see yours? And I'll give you a chance to type a number. Okay, Michelle, Aaron, Justine. So not a lot of the systematic planning for lessons in some situations. Now, as you type your answers, I wouldn't argue necessarily that our goal is to have all 10s or our goal is to have all 0s. It really, there are so many factors that inform where we want to be on this. And in fact, you might find that in one environment, it's a 10 for the first question, but it's for the third question, maybe it's it's a 0, or you flip that around. So maybe it's highly self-directed when it comes to monitoring progress, and it's highly teacher-directed when it comes to determining the outcomes or the standards. And so there's a broad mix. One can mix many of these. At the same time, what I would argue is regardless of the learning environment, that learners will be better off if they choose to treat the environment as self-directed, at least for number 2, 3, and 4. For how will I know when I've learned it? How will I monitor my progress? And how will I learn it? In other words, if we can empower and encourage and invite students to begin to ask those questions themselves, then this partnership between teacher and learner can be a powerful thing. We can see some amazing results happen. And we can see learners take more responsibility and ownership in the learning experience. Let me stop for a moment. I just want to see some of the questions or comments that are coming through and see if there's anything I should comment on. So the age group as a factor, certainly age group may be a factor here. At the same time, I think that we could argue, for example, the third one about monitoring progress. We can see young people at very young ages already begin to develop a growing capacity to monitor their own progress and to get a sense of how they're doing and how they're progressing toward a goal. We may keep it pretty concrete, but we can see young people do that. It also, a lot of these items on the right side, it's important at some point to give learners increased ability to ask and answer these questions for themselves, because it actually helps them develop the executive function of their brain. Now, part of that is developmental, but um, but some of it can also be developed. Some of it can be environmental as well, and giving students an environment where they have an opportunity to practice and to refine these things can help them develop them. Let me see here. The question is, I think they're more, let's see, oh, hormone directed. Very good. I'm trying to understand. Do you ask a question, Margaret, about where is that in your chart? And I'm trying to look back and see what that is referred to. Or are you talking about the hormone directed part? We will have to revise the chart to represent that part. But there is a developmental consideration. Nonetheless, I find this chart to be really helpful. I use this whenever I do consulting with different groups sometimes, and I ask them where they want to be, ideally, and where they want their learners to be. Now, I'll share honestly, I was told by years ago when I was working on my doctorate by one of my doctoral advisors that we learn too late that our convictions matter. And so I'm pretty open about my convictions, and I do believe that self-directed learning is an important and valuable goal in and of itself in learning organizations, because we really want to help learners develop this capacity to learn on their own. So I do lean toward that, but I don't necessarily argue that it's optimal or ideal in every course, in every environment, every grade level. That's a decision that has to be made in each individual context. Now, let's go to the self-directed learner then. Let's argue then, if we assume that my argument is that self-directed learning in some measure is good for all learners, even in a teacher-directed environment. We want learners to take more responsibility. Then, then here I argue sort of a before the lesson, during the lesson, and after the lesson approach. These are the kinds of questions that learners can begin to ask themselves. I just saw a comment about audio going off and on, so let me try to address that. Sometimes if I just reset my audio, it'll help out. So before the lesson, a learner can, after they learn about the lesson, they learn what they're supposed to be learning. Maybe the teacher has directed and established the goals and the objectives. The learner, as they develop good study habits and good habits as a student, they learn to ask the question, what's my plan for monitoring my progress? How am I going to know how I'm doing? And the learner has a chance to actually think through that and to try it out. So even creating an opportunity for learners to jot down this reflection can be really helpful. And then the teacher can give feedback to the learners on their plan, or they can get peer feedback. Also, the learner can ask the question, what tools or people or resources do I need in order to implement this plan for monitoring my progress? So in a lesson plan, one typically lists the resources that they need to use that lesson or to teach that lesson. Well, here the learner is actually saying, well, what people, resources, and tools do I need? And they actually plan those out in advance. This is a great way to teach just good planning skills and some good forethought on behalf of the students. And then during the lesson, the learner, what we're talking about is finding ways to help the learner ask these questions, where they have time to stop and say, how am I doing? And then we want to find a way for them to get some reliable and valid measures of how they're doing so they can use that data. Second, what adjustments do I need to make? So as the learner gets this data and this input about how they're doing, also figuring out, well, what do I do with that? Okay, so I wasn't very successful. Well, why? Or what did I do well? What do I need to adjust? And what kind of adjustments do I need to make? Again, this is where the teacher can help coach and guide the learner. The third one is, what adjustments do I need to make to my plan for monitoring my progress? So sometimes the learner discovers that their plan wasn't a helpful one. It's not giving them the kind of data that they need. And that's where they have to kind of adjust it. Again, the teacher can serve as a coach throughout this and help the learner. But one of the key pieces is just creating a place in the class where the students can actually ask these questions and start to reflect in this way. And then after the lesson, the learner has the chance to ask, well, what did I learn? And maybe even, how could I prove that I learned that? What evidence could I provide that I learned it? What went well? What didn't go well? What should I do next time? And what am I going to do next? Where do I want to go with this? Maybe the learner is very fascinated by the topic and they want to explore something independently or on their own. So this threefold approach can be a pretty helpful way of beginning to think about self-assessment and getting students in the habit of engaging in self-assessment questions. Let me stop for a moment and see if we have any comments or questions before we jump into the next couple of slides. And then I want to have a good 15 or at least 10 minutes for Q&A at the end as well. As I listen to see if there are any comments or questions, I will note that you can probably, as you look at this, you can probably think of learners who have done these things and they've been very successful. In fact, these questions are common questions for learners who've really learned how to learn, right? They've developed this capacity for self-directed learning, and yet what we sometimes do is we sometimes seem to assume that, well, the good learners ask these questions and the struggling learners don't. But sometimes we don't take the step to teach the struggling learners how to ask these questions, as if this is some kind of innate ability rather than a learned skill. And I would argue that it's very much a learned skill. That's something that can be learned. Now, granted, some people are more self-reflective than others, and there may be genetic predispositions and things that relate to that. I'm not arguing that we need to change someone's entire predisposition, but we can help them to be reflective enough to learn from their mistakes and to benefit from identifying their strengths and capitalizing on them. So here's another question that usually comes up. Self-assessment can get a bad rap. If you Google self-assessment and reliability or self-assessment and validity, you're likely to find lots of references, not just in self-assessment and learning, but like self-assessment tools that are used for healthcare purposes and other things like that. We find that there can be some significant problems with self-assessment because in order for self-assessment to work, the learner has to be able to accurately represent what they have or haven't learned. And so that can be problematic if that's not happening. With that said, I would like to draw your attention to a 2006 study, so it's a little bit older, called The Reliability, Validity, and Utility of Self-Assessment from Practical Assessment, Research, and Evaluation. It's a peer-reviewed journal. And the link here, you can just Google the title if you want to read it. It's a short article, it's only 13 pages, and it's a great read. But they do define validity a little bit differently than the way some people might think about it. But they talk about reliability, where the assessment is stable, and there are some consistent results. And they found that the reliability of self-assessment tools, they increase when students are trained, and I apologize for the typo, it should be how to instead of how to, but when students are trained in how to evaluate their work. So one thing, first of all, their study did find a good measure of reliability with regard to self-assessments, especially in a shorter term, like within a course, students engaging in self-assessments multiple times over a course of a unit or something like that. And validity didn't seem to be too much of a problem in many circumstances either. However, as you might expect, if learners didn't have the ability to self-assess, then their self-assessments were not very valid. That should go without being said. But I want to bring this up because in the next slide, I'm going to give some suggestions on how we might go about addressing this issue. Because I believe that we can fix it. Actually, I think it's 2 slides away. So let me just start with limitations. First of all, there are limitations to self-assessment. One is student wishful thinking. So sometimes students assess themselves as being better at something than they are when they engage in self-assessment. And that's really common as we look at studies on self-assessment in the classroom and other environments, is that people oftentimes, there are certainly some studies that have some exceptions to that in certain personality types and certain contexts. But in many cases, there's kind of this wishful thinking syndrome where people sort of assess themselves how they want to be rather than how they actually are. And that can be problematic and a limitation that we have to address. A second is the students may not recognize the nuance in their learning that comes with growing competence and expertise. So, for example, if you grew up around automobiles and you grew up working on automobiles and you learned about different types of cars and different parts of the engine and different things like that, even driving down the road may be a richer experience for you because you have a nuanced sense of what's different about the different cars and the different vehicles. For others of us, maybe we didn't grow up and we may know the difference between a truck and a sports car and a sedan and a compact vehicle, but that's about it. We don't have a sense of what's under the hood or why one car goes much faster than another or what a 6 versus an 8 cylinder or a 4 cylinder might be. We don't have that sophisticated knowledge. And so as a result, if my car's not working, even when I try to articulate to you what's wrong, I can maybe say, well, it makes a clunk, clunk, clunk sound whenever I press on the gas pedal. But I can't give you a more nuanced description of what's happening because I don't have the vocabulary for it, right? There's wonderful literature about the importance of academic discourse here we could look at, and uh, some great stuff from like Jim G on these kinds of topics and others. But this does become a limitation when we think about self-assessment, because the reality is one thing that teachers have to offer oftentimes is they have a greater level of knowledge or expertise in the content area, so they can give a level of feedback that the learner just won't know how to give yet. Third is that it does not seem to work as well when you have really unclear goals or objectives, because the assessment is so broad, it can be scattered, and it doesn't give one a sense of direction on, well, where do I go from here? They can reflect a lot, but how does that reflection help them achieve a given goal? Um, and a fourth limitation of self-assessment, and that some people point to, is that to do self-assessment well, it actually requires training people on how to do self-assessment. It's not something that we just sort of tell people to do, or we just create an opportunity for it and it happens magically. It's something that actually does require some intentional training. And then the fourth one is it benefits from comparing the self-assessment with other forms of assessment. In other words, self-assessment isn't always a great tool in and of itself. It works well when we triangulate it, or at least compare it with another form of assessment, like peer assessment or teacher assessment or a computer-generated assessment. Now that can be very powerful, especially in the early stages of self-assessment, because the learner can compare their self-assessment with this other form of assessment, and in the result, then they can learn to kind of hone their skills in self-assessment. So then how do we address some of these limitations, and how do we get back to that validity and reliability issue? I would offer these points as some starting places. One, I think it's really important to teach the why of self-assessment, so students understand this is a way to give you ownership, to give you a chance to kind of have a stake in what's happening in the learning, and help students understand that self-assessment can help them become learners and help them to achieve things. A second way to improve self-assessments is we want to use really clear goals and objectives, because then it's easier to come up with plans for how to measure your progress. The third is to provide really explicit teaching on self-assessment. So finding a way to take students through the self-assessment process, to model it, to give examples, to give non-examples or bad examples of self-assessment, to practice self-assessment with others. The next one is then use self-assessment tools. So if a learner does not have that basic knowledge or that nuanced knowledge of the topic, why not give them some checklists or some rubrics or some guides, some things to look for, some guiding questions, some things to ask. So that can help sort of bolster a student's ability to self-assess. And then over time, those checklists and rubrics and guides can become sort of internal. They become functioning in the mind of a student. And I think I might have given this example before, but I played basketball in high school and in college. And when I stand at the free throw line to play basketball, it's as if I hear my coaches, all those instructions on what I'm supposed to do and form and other things like that, they come to mind. I have sort of these built-in checklists from coaches from years past. And using self-assessment tools can help students to develop some of those internal checklists. Next, Discuss the self-assessment tools and practice with them. So if we give the students these tools, then we try them out together. Then we pull out a piece of work and pretend like we had done it, and then we review it with the checklist, and we have a conversation with the students about it. And that can be a helpful teaching tool. It's related to the third bullet point about providing explicit teaching. Have students compare their self-assessments with other types of assessments. As I talked about, that's one of the limitations before. So if there is a problem with sometimes students um, having the wishful thinking syndrome, then why not just have them compare it with other peer assessments and other kinds of computer-generated assessments and other assessments that are possible for us to use. And then next, workshop self-assessments. So actually have students verbalize out loud their self-assessment, and then you can sort of coach them through it and guide them and give them some explicit instruction. And they can actually hear you give this feedback in front of their peers. You have to do it obviously in a safe environment where it doesn't feel judgmental, where they understand that this is just kind of a learning process. But that kind of workshopping, just like you would workshop a paper, and students would bring a paper and they'd read it and then they give each other feedback, we can workshop the exercise of self-assessing their own work in a similar way. So that's my content for you, and I didn't have a great kind of closing comment, but I wanted to leave time, and we do have 10 minutes. There's a wonderful side conversation happening, but let's just stop and see if we have any other questions or comments that people would like to share. I see some comments, but I'm not sure if they were asked of me or others. For example, Jennifer earlier on said, you mentioned focus on strengths. Do you find students focus on strengths or weaknesses? Jennifer, was that a question for me? Great. Well, let me tackle that one then. So in terms of what I find, I don't have any data set to really tell me what students tend to focus upon. But I can say I do have ample evidence to point to the fact that most traditional learning organizations encourage us to focus upon deficits. Most learning organizations are focused, and most assessments largely, are focused upon telling us what we have not learned yet and what we're not as good at. And that's just the nature of how we use assessments today. So a strength-based approach to education can be a challenge in those environments unless we really shift our understanding of what an assessment is. So in terms of students, my guess is that most students would also sort of begin to replicate that. In fact, I can say that if you read the literature on self-assessment, you'll find that one of the problems with self-assessment, and I don't just mean self-assessment for learning, I mean self-assessments in many ways, is that we do find that sometimes there is a measure of depression that comes with self-assessment. That students, as they begin to self-assess, they become more aware of their limitations and their weaknesses. And so that's something that that's why we need to do some explicit teaching, is we want to try to invite our students to look at these differently. This is not about beating yourself up and discovering how bad you are at everything or all of your gaps and your limitations. It's simply a tool to give you an accurate sense of where you are now so you can progress a little bit forward from there. So sort of a relative understanding of our progress. Where did I start and where am I now? So they can see progress. And that's where you can help them make that shift to more of a strength-based approach and a more positive approach. So Denise, absolutely. That's where I think some of the things I argued, you wrote, Tim Elmore would argue that students have an inflated sense of self. How does that play into the ability to assess themselves? That definitely ties into what I mentioned before about the limitation of self-assessment. So the way to address that is to bolster it with some other types of assessments as well. Let me scroll down here. My experience, Margie wrote, is that the imposter syndrome keeps students from asking good questions. If I find out what I don't know, I'll get kicked out. Oh, sure, that's absolutely an issue we need to work through. I think it's important to remember when we assess students. Yep, great. I'm just kind of skimming through. Sorry for reading out loud. Any templates for self-assessments? That's a great question, Heather. You know, I didn't take the time to put any together. that'd be a great thing for us to explore. We do have the Google Plus community. I'll look around and see if I have something, Heather, and see if I can add it to the Google Plus community for Beyond Letter Grades. It's just called Learning Beyond Letter Grades if you're not in there, if some of you are not in there. But I'll take a look and see if I can add something. If some of you have some good examples of self-assessments, consider sharing them there as well. Another question is about how to include self-assessment within limited teaching time, right? That's certainly a challenge. The issue that I would just propose, and I know this is maybe sidestepping the question, but I would argue that if we have limited teaching time, if by that we mean that we have limited time to cover the material, my question is really, we already have limited learning time, and even if we cover all the material, it doesn't equate that students have learned that material. And self-assessment and any kind of formative assessment is going to help students learn more effectively, and they're going to retain things. So I guess I don't really know if we have an alternative. If we want to be about the outcomes and the results and the student learning and outcomes, we're going to have to find some way to implement at least modest opportunities for formative feedback. With that said, these can be done very quickly. They can be 30 and 60-second sort of exit tickets that students fill out when they leave the class. They can be little 60-second reflections. You can do pair share, where it's sort of a peer assessment. Students kind of share their knowledge with another person in the room very quickly in 60 to 120 seconds. So you can do this without taking up a lot of time. And then Denise asked the question, at what age can students be self-aware in learning? And now some people give the answer to that and they jump right to something like Piaget's stages of development, and they might make the distinction between concrete and formal operations. With that said, I have seen young people at 5 or 6 engage in a self-awareness of their learning. Certainly not the kind of self-awareness that we see with an 18 or a 28 or a 68-year-old, but a measure of self-awareness. So for example, student at age 6 can say, have I accomplished the goal of stacking 7 blocks up without them falling over? Yes or no? Did I achieve that or did I not achieve that? And so they can engage in some measure of self-assessment, but this is where we can guide them. And I would argue that we do see young people at very young ages already having a sense of when they have or have not accomplished something, and they become aware of that at young ages, and that in essence is a form of self-assessment. Deborah wrote, do you have suggestions for good studies that would help illustrate to faculty that spending the time on self-assessment is of value? The one study that I shared before, Deborah, is a good one. That's a useful study, the one from 2006. And I could pull out some other resources that I've gathered together in my research. I could try to put that on the Google Plus community as well. I would argue, though, that really the key is not just self-assessment. I would package self-assessment along with formative assessment, and then you have just a massive body of knowledge. It's very hard to question. In fact, let me see if I can look. I'm going to look up the citation. Some of you may have seen the book called New Frontiers of Assessment. It comes out of Harvard Press. And I'm not necessarily promoting that you purchase it at Amazon, but just because it was an easy reference, I'm going to provide a quick link. This is one of the most powerful books that I've seen on assessment. It's called New Frontiers in Formative Assessment. And as I said, it comes out of Harvard Press, and it's from 2011, very current research. It's an impressive work, and it makes a very compelling argument for the importance of formative assessment in learning organizations and in learning environments. Let me just continue to go back. Yes, Heather, I should probably consider adding that a bit more to my own webinar about the 10-2 model.